However, what I started to realize and why like these abalone, there's so many pictures of abalone right here, is because I started to see these like small moments of abundance. And then they turned into like big moments of abundance. And these species, these abalone that I've never seen alive in a tide pool in Los Angeles or Malibu. I mean, people talk about in the past they were, but they've been so over um, taken by humans that this was the first time I ever saw them. And it wasn't just like one, it was like a thriving multitude. And for me, it's like, well, what model of existence and care exists in that place that can then be brought back here? So it's not like only looking backwards, it's actually looking into the future. And so I try to like grapple with that positioning and not just looking like, this kind of cycle of time instead of it being this like linear backwards and forwards thing. So these images came out of these. Some of these are in the exhibition. There was a lot of feeling of disorientation that I felt being out there, in that same sense of it feeling very familiar and also very foreign in ways. Like I recognized things, but there were moments that were also unrecognizable. I'm going to do that photographer thing right now and say, they don't look like they do up there. Every lecture you ever go to, the photographer's going to say that. Anyways, you'll see some of these images are in the show, but it was really important for me to really be present, to really respond. And in a sense, like a lot of my work, I am trying to show a subjective viewpoint. I'm not trying to be I'm not approaching the land in a way that is about these vistas of wilderness, which is this kind of fantasy that was built by early photography around the California or around the West in general. And so I wasn't trying to do it. I know there are a couple of horizon lines that exist, but not many. I was trying to really create a sense of intimacy and subjectivity and closeness that for me is what relationship with the land is about. I also was looking at certain materials that were used and are used in our cultural practices, whether it's seagrass for basket, like a twining, or the abalone, which have really important cultural significance. I'll talk more about that when I get to the abalone section. But what does it mean to kind of interact? Okay, then we're gonna get to the foxes. I told you we talk about this idea of safety. These little foxes are the largest mammal on Limu, right? Catalina is different. There's different politics of Catalina, but they're about this big. They're like the cutest things ever. Wait, I'm gonna skip forward just for a minute. Wait, sorry. This one. So this is like, this is like kind of like the interaction you have with these little foxes. They don't have fear. They're curious. They're not like brush up against you, but they're still cautious. But they don't have that fear. This little fox kind of walked around a corner, and I knew it was coming, so I was just waiting patiently. And it kind of like stopped, like looks at me, and I swear it posed for the picture at the end, like that little smile, where it's like, okay, you can take my picture. I wanted to go there because it's in this experience, in making this image, I came upon these two little foxes. They were lying down. I didn't think they were actually alive, so I kind of walked up briskly, like much less carefully than I would have had they been staring at me. And so they kind of like perked up, and it was really when I got this sense that I was absolutely being allowed to be in their space. Sometimes we're here and we're like, oh, the coyotes are coming down into our neighborhoods, and you're like, actually we've encroached deeply into their homes, and so it was this moment of like interaction. They just kind of stared at me, and then the one came out from behind the bush being like, what are you doing here, which is usually this like complete reversal of how we interact with other like beings in our daily life, especially animals and plants. And so it was really important for me. I put this one in because those are little fox footprints on the beach. Like you go down the beach and it's fox prints. It's not people. It's not anything else. It's these little fox fox trails, and that's what you follow. Like when I go there, there's not paved roads, there aren't hiking trails. You're really following the trails of the animals that are the inhabitants of this place. So we saw that one. The other thing that really was a big impact to me was early on. There's this small well, I'm on video. It's a small museum-y kind of space on the island where they have historical ephemera of the family that lived there for a very long time. But I walked over, and this bowl on the right is like this big, no joke. The walls are this thin, and the little tag down there says it's from Catalina. And so I was really thinking about the exchange of what it meant to be here. I mean, I've been really fortunate to work in my own tribal territory for much of my life in my work. And I was very aware of what it meant to be in neighboring territory. There are a lot of markers of human presence on this island that I very intentionally do not photograph. I don't show. It is not my place to show it. So it was something I really grappled with. But this bowl really got me thinking about the exchange between the islands and the trade that happened between the islands and the mainland. And steatite is one of these materials that comes up. This is one of the quarries on Pimungna or Catalina Island. And it's one of these really important cultural materials that is a stone that can be carved into like that delicate of an object at that scale. And so that really impacted me to think about what, in addition, it was the abalone, it was the steatite, and it's the tar, which I'll also get to. But so, so I went out to Catalina, to Pimungna, to look at the quarries out there. And my father's like, we're going to go to a quarry. And in my head, I think industrial quarry, like you have an idea of what a quarry is. And he takes me to this, and I was kind of just awestruck because essentially, I don't know. Can I? Let's, my cursor doesn't show up. I don't have a little laser. I don't want a laser. Um, those round marks are essentially where people would have carved into the stone to make the beginnings of that bowl, and that kind of scar is where it kind of got taken off. And so the bowls began in this place, and then were removed, and then were transported off across through other islands or across a 24-mile channel in a tiat or a tamol, which are wood plank, essentially canoes. So think about the idea of crossing that channel with a large stone objects and the sophistication of understanding, one, how to build those watercrafts, also how to navigate the sea, to know the seasons and the tides and the weather so well that you're able to make that crossing. So I think about how sophisticated, like these experiences, what they point to of the people who inhabited before we are all here. I put this image in because it shows an inlay of, it's hard to see, but there's tar on the left, is asphaltum or tar. There are natural tar seeps that occur. There's some I found on this island. If you think of Carpinteria, where there's a big one, that's because a lot of these tamols were made there, right? And so it's, Carpinteria is like, carpintero, like it's like a place of making. And it's called that by the Spanish because it was the site where these boats were made because the asphaltum or tar was used to make them watertight. So like this is a really important material for these watercrafts, and a really sophisticated understanding of what to mix them with. I think it was a resin to make them harden and watertight. And so I'm always looking for these markers in the land that point us to these stories and tellings and understandings. But if you go to Carpinteria, you can still see these tar seep remnants, or they're dried up. But it got me really interested in these tar things, which is all right here. Also in the way of like growing up in Los Angeles and the La Brea tar pits, which was probably, I mean, my idea is that it was also one of these sites of making. Like you think about where you go to have materials to make a thing. So it's very functional, but it's also used for the inlay to decorate these bowls. And so the bowl would have been carved out, and then the tar would have been inlaid with these shell beads to decorate. I really get into ideas around blurring some of the categories we want to place on people or objects. And the steatite is used functionally for bowls, but it's also used for ceremonial objects. There's a lot of different things. And much like the tar is functionally used for sealing these watercrafts, it's also used for inlay. And then, okay, let's see. I'm just going to say this really quick. The abalone also has multifunction. It's a food source. They were made fish hooks, so like it was a fishing, a functional thing. Regalia or ceremonial, like we still have regalia. I love to wear them. But so like sometimes people want to be like, oh, you're this, and this is your box, your category, or you're this. And it's like, or this is, looking in, I've worked a lot on archaeological sites, and like this object is used for this function. And I think that we need to be like a little, I think people are more sophisticated than that. I think we're able to see things in a multi-purposed way. And I think it's important to remember that. I'm going to now get into like the formation of this exhibition a little bit. And I put these images in because that's me swimming in this, oh wait, we got another fox. My daughter made me, I don't know if it's going to play. My daughter made me put this in. She's like, you have to put it in. But it's kind of like watching me because I had a headlamp on and it was like coming up and it's like, what are you doing here? I was like, what are you doing here? So yeah, that's the little fox friends that come up. I'm saying this to say like there is a sense of like calm and safety and interaction that was really impactful for me and really formed what I wanted to have as a feeling in this exhibition. I put this picture of me swimming in that swimming hole. Oops, oh, it's gonna play again. We'll just watch it again. I love the little head bobble. But that doesn't run too far away. It's like, I'm still here. Okay, because this, also in addition to these materials and interactions with objects, there's also this idea of the water and what that means to all of us. This is a swimming hole that I don't usually show the picture of me in it because it kind of breaks the like feeling of it. But what does it mean to be in this place? This particular place became really important. It kind of became the centerpiece of the exhibition because it was when I made these inversions. Those images exist as images, but I was looking at this like straightforward images, but then this is actually an inversion of that same space. And I kind of mean that in like I shoot film and I scan the film and they all come in a certain way, and then I have to like flip it, and make it like how the eye sees it, like all this kind of reversals. But there was something about this before I reversed it, which essentially becomes like a color negative, that really to me did reference some of these early images of California and the West and the sepia tone, these like grand vistas. But as you think you understand this image in that context, you get to the bottom and it kind of turns purple and it kind of falls apart. You're like, I don't think I'm looking at what I think I'm looking at. And I think in our conceptions of history and the land, a lot of times you're not actually looking at what you think you're looking at. Or there's so many held stories and histories that aren't present or aren't in the forefront. And so I really wanted to think about that. I put this sketch in. This is like, again, I thought this would be like super like informal. And so I put some of the like fun things of like how a show is made, which this really pieced together in an organic way, which is a scary way. I'm sure Meldia can agree to do something like this, because all I knew is it had 5 concentric circles. And I kept doing these sketches of these 5 circles. And that comes from a special solstice site. And to me and my research, it's about the 5 worlds. And when I think about 5 worlds, that's not how I grew up with like this world, and that world, and kind of good and bad, and good and evil, and black and white, and these kind of things where you're like, what is darkness always bad? Is light always good? Like I grapple with these things. So if there are 5 worlds, what does that mean? What does that build? Like, what is the complexity in there? And I was trying to kind of break away from having it be an experience that I'd already kind of worked with. So I put in some like behind the scenes. So the inversions of those images became these plexiglass panels. Those became, there's like a center ring, which I'll get to because it was the last thing that really came together. It's like the second ring out. For me, it creates a circle. And it's about the kind of transparency of them as images, the reflective, the way you can see through. Um, it was a new material, a new process, a new whole experience. And so that was, I say that to say, like, it was scary, you know, in a sense, to kind of take this leap of like, I know this is going to work. I can't exactly tell you how exactly it's all going to come together, but like I had to follow it. And so there's these three images, two from the watering hole and one from another beach that I was in of a cave. And these kind of became these images in the show. And it was really important for me to have people to be able to walk through an experience at different levels. I think a lot about thresholds and how we move through the world. And a threshold to me is something that's like a ideological or otherwise kind of like a line that we kind of choose to cross or not. And like, what does it mean to cross into a space? And so I tried to build this in a way that allowed the viewer to kind of continue to cross in as they chose and not kind of either block people or impose that somebody gets to where I'm trying to get them to be. So that's kind of the like circular organic formation of the space. Some of the images became these portals for me, like up through time and space, and also referencing the water and the tides. There was so much in experiencing the tides on these islands that I had to learn how to be and interact with them. All of these abalone, I've imaged many times. I go back and back and back and kind of can't stop myself. And I always say I photograph until the light goes away or the tide comes up too high because one of those things is going to happen. But I also went there on my second trip to one of these places, and there were no abalone. And I thought, did somebody come and take them all? Did someone discover it? Did they move? They don't really move them. Like, this is a lot of abalone to like up and move. And I was like, I'm there at the low tide. I wasn't at a good low tide. I had to learn like what actually a good low tide meant because they were all there, probably like laughing a little bit, chuckling. And so I'm like, am I in the right place? I think I am. You know, I think I recognize this because I didn't go when the good low tide was, and so they were all covered. And so I think a lot about these spaces of like what's concealed, what gets revealed, what we wait for, what we ask for, what we spend the time to kind of experience. Like this takes a lot of patience and a lot of time. And you know, part of this initiative of the cohort of Unseen California is that it's over the course of 2 years. So this wasn't like I got to go for a week and I had to like do everything I had to do in that week. I mean, I made images the first week I was there, but the depth of engagement has allowed, I mean, there's only a few images in here that were made on that first trip because it was about knowing what I was experiencing and not maybe trying to take everything in, but to understand what my relationship with the place was. I put this in because, like, yeah, this is like the process where you're like, I don't know what pictures are going to happen. I had a lot of help. Aspen Mays, who was on that first trip, really has helped me edit. And, you know, she gets to have me on those calls where I'm like, okay, will you look through this PDF with me? And sometimes other people can see things that you don't notice at first. And I say that not knowing if there's artists in the room, but I feel like those communities of engagement are just so important to keep. Then I started playing with this. A friend gave me this piece of obsidian, and I, again, was following this trajectory, not exactly knowing how it would come together. But I started casting them, and making these kind of colorful versions of them. I think a lot about, I think when I think about this kind of a presentation in many communities, but also in the Native community, there's a lot of conversation around authenticity, realness, and I think it can go into territories where it's very harmful. And what does that mean? And at what point are we trying to get to? And how do we harm each other by trying to kind of fight against this idea that somebody's real and somebody's not? And so I just like that they're all perfect kind of replicas of each other, and it's not meant to be about which is the real one. It's about, aren't these beautiful versions of a material that is, again, a very important cultural material that wasn't physically found here but traded in. It would have been made points and other tools, but it also has this beautiful glass-like translucency, which is why I kind of went into this material for it. Yeah. I also wanted to talk about some of the feeling of the show, and the image on the right is me and my father. The image on the left is me and my daughter. When we did the show in the fall, it was really exciting to kind of bring people together. And I wasn't in it, which was not intentional, you know. I ended up kind of helping, like doing an arrangement of my father's instrument. So I was like there a little bit, like through him, and my daughter put a little piece in that arrangement as well. But it was about lightness and brightness. And one of our Tongva elders, I always tell a story where people ask him about like, oh, well, where's the line between you and this group or you and that border? And he says, you tell me where one color of like the pink abalone turns into the blue abalone, and that's your line. Because it shifts with reflection, it shifts with position, much like water, marriage, all these other kind of ways. Borders are a colonial construct that are like, you know, this is my line and that's your line and this is me and that's you. And so you know, it was a lot about shifting that. And, you know, we had colorful lights in there, and there were artists from a lot of Tongva artists and neighboring tribal people, which was also a really beautiful moment to have these people come together. But when I thought about, okay, now I'm switching into this role as doing this exhibition, it felt funny to be like, okay, now there's this one person who's now going to have a room full of things. I felt like like I was like, well, why wouldn't they have just been the first show? And why did they get to have this whole other space? And so I really wanted it to feel different and to shift the like tone. So I put this picture from that exhibition. Oh, wait, we're going to skip a little bit ahead because I need to finish this one trajectory. My computer can do this, I think. This. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about these abalone shells I made if I have time. Meldia, you'll time check me if I'm going way too long. I was thinking about the backside of the abalone, the like the protective layer, these dark blues and purples and browns. And it's not this like bright iridescent interior that like, you know, the inside is what we normally look like, but it was kind of this reversal to that space. So this shell, which is something I made for the Getty, which I'll now go back and talk about a little bit, really inspired this kind of inversion. You know, thinking a lot about the photographs that I was inverting, but you know, I had just come off of this, you know, the tail ends of this project where I was really, I mean, I've clearly been very inspired by these abalone shells and my interactions with them. But I did this project where I was making, they're between 4 feet and 12 feet abalone shells that are hanging in the Getty. I put some photos in for fun. And this was also a very new process. I'd never ever done anything like this before. Again, scary. Again, new materials and techniques. And in a certain sense, I'll just tell the story. I proposed this in a way of like, what about this? You know, I had this idea. It was about I've been going out to the islands. We always say, oh, on a clear day we can look at Catalina. I was like, well, what does Catalina see looking back here? You know, like, how do we decenter this, like, I'm up on a hill looking down over there, and maybe, like, elevate these beings to actually listen to them and and maybe pay attention a little bit better to what they can tell us instead of thinking we're, like, gonna tell you how things are. And so these were all supposed to be human scale. They were supposed to be about 4 to 6 feet. That space needed larger, so they doubled in size, which was not easy. But a lot of it was about light alignment. I think a lot about the sun and how we orient ourselves and how we move through the land, how we pay attention. If we can attune ourselves into a certain space, we can see and experience and feel a whole lot more. And so a lot of the light that comes in. Oh, my daughter also made me put this in. She bought Sean the sheep and wanted him to be in the shells. She's been sick, so I let her do this. So a lot of this was about interacting with the sunlight of that space that you don't necessarily pay attention to always. It's like it's there, but it's such a presence there. You put your sunglasses on because it's so overwhelmingly bright and white when you walk. I mean, into like that open space, and so I really wanted to bring the sun as an element. It reflects off these window treatments onto the shells, onto the floor. They move, kind of like this underwater feeling. But I was really trying to kind of reorient our kind of idea that we're all knowing sometimes around things, the way we move through the world. So this is how the show came into play. So this is one of the objects in the other room. These kind of so okay. So what this turned into is we have the center ring, we have the inversion hanging images, and then set the ring out from that is these curved walls that actually Jeff had this idea of making a curved wall, and I was like, because originally I wanted to curve the whole space. I'm like, why don't we just make it round? Wouldn't that be great to like change the feeling? Not entirely practical because of the like architecture of the space, but we were like, how do you get that feeling of like shifting the experience of like, you know, a four-wall kind of white space gallery, which is what I often am often working in. So these curved walls came into play, and originally they were going to have a different treatment, and then I was like, no, I think they're cross sections of these shells. So because I always wanted the back to represent the back, and I was like, well, I don't need a fabricator. I'll just make the inside look like abalone. Which was another process and another experience. I put this in, you can't really see the color, but they really change color depending on the light. So like they kind of have this iridescence to them. Again, my daughter. But you know, they were this kind of process of texturing, painting. You know, I very much tried to look at the shells and mark the lines and this kind of idea. This is like very like I really don't usually show this kind of stuff, but this process, you know, how do you sculpt a shell? And there was some muscle memory of interacting with the other shells were actual 3D scans of actual abalone shells that were then cut out with a 5-axis drill into high density foam and coated. And so that's the form I got them in, this kind of coated. So I wasn't actually sculpting them. And so this I actually had to sculpt. And I was like, okay, all right, what is this going to be? And then, you know, this kind of experience of working in them on them in the studio. There was this really beautiful, oh, you can't see it. There's this really beautiful moment where the sun, the whole sky was a sunset, and it like completely mirrored the shells that I was painting, and it made me just feel like sometimes you have to like take in those moments of alignment that like you're in the right place doing the right thing. I think something got a little out of order, so I'm gonna see. Oh no, maybe oh, it doesn't matter. So yeah, so these walls, it's okay, became that kind of othering. And I talked about the photographs, but those were the fourth ring of the exterior space. Like, and there was something a little bit about shifting into realms of reality and scale. But my hardest part to figure out was what is the center? You know, like what is the center? And I think a lot of times there's like the four directions, and they have these significant meanings about like births and endings and strength and I often think about those four, but there's also like the inner core and the outer. So like there's almost six for me. And so in a certain sense, the center for me was like, well, what is that core space? Like what am I saying is the center? And I think it was the hardest part for me to like settle on. And so I really kind of went back to the experience of being in that water, the swimming hole, the spring water swimming hole, where like you're floating in it and you're like, I'm simultaneously like the center of the universe and nowhere. Like I'm all time and no time. It's just this kind of feeling of like I'm very present, but also like completely in another world. Like it just had that sense of expansion for me and thinking about the experiences I had there, the experiences of being on this island, the experience of safety, the experience of connection, and all of that kind of wrapped into like these moments that we have often around water. I think of water springs in Los Angeles, how important they've always been, how many of them no longer flow because they've been capped, but it's why we are a Mediterranean climate, why we sustain the amount of plants and animals that and population historically. So these bowls came into play, and they're um, crafted, sculpted after an actual grinding bowl that I interacted with. And this is a grinding bowl that wouldn't have been, it's not that big, large one. It's not like a big, like acorn type one. It's a very like delicate, small material, whether that's pigments or medicines. But there was something about going into that very intimate hand kind of holding scale that also felt expansive in a certain sense. And so I put this in because I thought it was funny. This is how we planned out the, this is kind of like the backstory of how some of these things happen. I was making these bowls and I kept making them and kept making them. And I was using this kind of process where they were iridescent and I knew they were going to hold water because some of the angling felt like the phases of the moon to me, which were so important to understanding in context of the tides. But it wasn't about one. It wasn't like a singular object. It was about understanding the different levels of water, the different angles. So this is how we planned it out. Poor Jeff got this sketch of like, this is what I'd like, please. But wait for it. This is what it turned into, And I think I like to show some of that stuff because sometimes you're in your studio and you're like, there was a lot of leaps of faith of like, this is how I know I want it, but I couldn't completely see it. And so this is kind of this arrangement that is, it's not about a singular bowl, it's not about a singular pedestal, it's about this like arrangement and experience and the ability to walk and to as your footsteps rattle the ground, the water moves and your kind of physical interactions. One interesting thing I've learned through this material and filling them with water is concrete absorbs water. So on the night of the opening, I walked up. I was like, why is this empty? But the bowl had absorbed all of the water that we put in. I'm sure you're still.
And it doesn't leak.
Yeah, it doesn't leak.
It just holds it.
It doesn't come out the bottom. It's not touching the plant.
Fully absorbed.
Yeah, which I don't know where that's going, but I think that will turn into some other conceptual holdings at some point. And so this, oops. So I just, this is kind of how it turned. And then for me, this is the fifth. This is the fifth circle. That's why that little abalone shell, is in the back there. Because it's kind of, I thought about this space. It's so physically different. There's so much different light that like, this is kind of like where you can enter is like, I can decode this. There was a little bit about this kind of multiplicity of looking or a grid or this kind of introspection, but also, what's the opposite of that? Investigation of like a thing where you're trying to like parse out the pieces and understand it, which I think is where I started. And for me, that door right there really became like that threshold to enter into that next space and that where things really shift. So for me, it was this kind of one of my first installations was titled "A Map for Moving Between Worlds," and I think about that and how we move through our experience in 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 our whole existence. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rings. You can kind of see them there. And then I have to thank Nick. So Nick Lee is not here, but Nick really was uh, vital. I keep telling him I couldn't have done this without you, and he's like, no, it was you. I was like, no, no, for real. Really vital in the Getty project. Anais Franco also helped me with the Getty project, but Nick helped me with this. And I also wanted to thank the Oxy team because there was so much collaboration and trust and openness. I kind of wanted to talk through the fact that a lot of this came together in pieces because it takes a lot of trust from an organization or institution to allow you to work that way. But I'm so proud of how it came together and like that trust and like what you know in your core and you know is going to come through, but you can't fully articulate in the moment. But I mean, Alex and Jeff and Meldia and Frankie and Rory and everybody really as a team was so supportive throughout the whole process and having conversations and talking things through in that same way where you kind of can have these moments where you're not just kind of working in like your own like experience, but really kind of having a collective conversation around things. So I have no idea how long that was, but that's the end of the presentation. I'm like super happy to answer questions as I'm able, if people have that, or go back to things or clarify. Mm. Yeah.
When you look through the camera lens, like, what's your like relationship with that in terms of like maybe like taking these intimate pictures of the lens? Like, do you feel like it creates any distance, or is it like somehow like allowing you to see differently?
So I've been working with a camera for a very long time. I started shooting film. Don't date me too much. At a certain age, I very much still enjoy shooting film because the experience of looking through the camera um, forces you to look through the camera and to look to where you are. For me, other people work differently, but for me, if I have that little screen that's like, this is what you just did, I get so wrapped up in that I stop being able to respond to what I'm seeing. For me, working with a camera is very intuitive. I don't go out, other than being like, I want to go look at the abalone. I don't have like a pre-visioned anything. I mean, the first trip to the island, I put that like pile of film there. That's like this much of the film that I like. The first trip, it was just like I was taking photos of everything because it was so new and it was so beautiful. I mean, we just kept joking about saying beautiful, beautiful. This is so beautiful over and over again because it was just like so breathtaking and inspiring. As I've gone back, I kind of understand the spaces that I'm like interacting with in a deeper level. Um, for me, the camera has always been this tool where I'm trying to show indigenous presence, whether that's through my work in Los Angeles at different places where I'm physically intervening, or really, this is kind of my idea of being like these subjective, like what does it mean for me as a person who has a certain context culturally and through experience of working in like archaeological sites or these other ways of seeing the land in a different context. What does that look like? I like to engage with the idea that the photograph infers permanence, and so for me, there's something about the permanent presence that's important to like iterate as a Native person. I definitely, this is like an early trip. You see that big heavy camera and a tripod. I did shift into using a different camera that I could put in a backpack and hand hold, and so there was also a new process with the tools. But for me, it's really intuitive, which is why sometimes it's hard to be like, and this is exactly what's going to look like at the end. Because a lot of it is about those conversations and understandings and looking multiple times, not in like pre crafting everything in the moment, in a prior idea. Yeah. Yeah.
What made you choose square format for that shot?
Yeah, so I've worked in Square for a long time. When it started is because I had a family member give me a Rolleiflex, like their old Rolleiflex, which is like a square through the twin lens, so you look down to look forward, which makes you do things like this when you're using it, which is kind of fun. I liked playing with the idea as giving, like we tend to associate the square format in the photography realm as like a portrait. You think Avedon, like you think of these people who use it as a portrait, or even the Hasselblad is like a portrait camera. It's not, this landscape kind of thing. But I like the idea of making portraits in these spaces. So to me, it's like these are beings that are being kind of imaged in ways that are supposed to have that same sort of respectfulness. So I was playing a little bit about expectation around most landscape photographs look a lot more like, that. That's probably the most traditional, as much as it's not a traditional photograph. To me, look, it has a horizon line. It's this, and we even say landscape and portrait mode, right? So there's kind of trying to break down these expectations of when we look at the land, what we're supposed to see, what we're supposed to understand, what it's supposed to look like. And a lot of those early photographs completely tried to remove any native presence, which was there, but it was really about making this into this idea of a wild space that needed to be harnessed. Even though it had been tended for generations, it just wasn't visible in a certain sense. And so I'm always trying to play with a little bit, even if it's like a silly like photo joke kind of way. It's not, it's like it's about breaking these expectations of what we say when I say do I say I'm a landscape photographer? I don't know. Like so I've asked, like is that a landscape photograph? We had this conversation with Shayna at SF MoMA, was a curator there, like what constitutes a landscape photograph, because it's this box, it's this category, right? When it's like these boxes, you want to like place things, but again, I think it's more complicated than that. To me, it's about the land. If it's about the land, then it fits in that. So that's kind of my loose understanding. Yeah. Yes.
Playing on that idea,
Mhm.
when I did see your exhibit at the Getty,
Mhm.
I was in awe. And what you said about shifting perspective,
Mhm.
I was just like, that's exactly what I felt. I've never seen grandiosity of the shells,
Mhm.
and felt like the wisdom of them. Um, but in terms of your photographs, is
Mhm.
there other ways you're thinking about shifting that perspective in terms of scale?
Yeah, some of these is it, I like to imagine that I've definitely had these interactions with people where they're like, "Oh, I know exactly what this is. Which one is it? This one. That's like a no, wait, it's like a waterway looking over a hillside, right?" I was like, "No, it's like this close to like an odd. I've had this conversation like, how do we understand? How do we orient ourselves? Like, what do we do as people when those markers of are taken away, and how do we kind of um, allow ourselves to kind of like lose a little bit of understanding? It's not perfectly lined up in this, but there's something about how the rock line kind of connects for me in those three is why they sit together. And that's a lot about this, like, you're kind of constantly doing this, like, it was about the disoriented feeling where you're kind of looking down and you're looking up and you're looking down and up at the same time. And so I think about that, like grouping those two together. And then the other one I think about in connection is maybe that diptych, which kind of also lines up in a formal way. And this is simultaneously like a hillside of a watering hole and a giant kind of wall filled with shell fossils in a cove, and so I think it's trying to get people to feel that kind of push and pull between the spaces and how we our proximity to things. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah.
How did you come up the name? Where
Where sky touches water. That's a very good question. Thank you. I looked through a lot of. I'm not really great at titles of work. This has been like an ongoing. We need the titles. I'm like, I know. Um, I we had a lot of ideas. It kind of was inspired. Melody and I had a studio visit early on, and I said this thing about like, well, where does the sky begin? You know, like at what point are we in it right now? Like, yes, there's atmosphere, but with this idea of sky, like, and so we played with that, and it didn't feel quite right as the title as in its entirety. But I wanted to point to this idea, like where sky touches water. And in a certain sense, your like obvious thing is like, yeah, maybe like a horizon line looking out into the ocean, and it's like a line, but that's not at all where it exists in this work. And it's a lot about reflection and experience and these kind of moments of touching the where, like the word where. It was really because I wanted to point to these islands particularly. There was a moment where, I mean, there's a lot of other conceptual things that went into this in conversation, but when I was like at the core of the show, it's really inspired by this place. Like it has to point to the place. So you know, like the intricacy of like where, and there was something about touching that it's not about meats. It's like actual physical haptic kind of interaction. And I think a lot of the experience out there was like, I think about like floating when you put your hands on like the surface of that, just that surface of the water, like where it rests. But there's something about like touching that's not just about like it is this like physical interaction, but it's also like how we're touched by experiences and kind of have that moment. And so I was kind of trying to like mess a little bit with our idea of like maybe where sky touches water points to where does the sky begin in a certain sense, or it makes you question a little bit. I like to get people, or you know, I like to have conversations. Some of my students are here, so they know this, like around like, you know, these questions that really aren't particularly answerable. And sometimes that feels awkward to be in a teaching position where you're not having the answer, but I think that's part of the point of conversation and education. So it's really often these provocations to think and imagine or contemplate. So yeah, yeah.
I think I'm really interested in those unanswered questions that you're speaking to, and
Mm-hmm.
also that question of like what does the land experience when I touch it, right? Like that,
Mm-hmm.
or that reversal that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, what do you hope the land receives from this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's would be nice for people to kind of appreciate the possibility of actually caring for land, what that could be. Um, I I had another part to that answer. Um, I okay. Oh, that's what it was. Okay, sorry. So there was something about like care. You know, like what does it mean to move through a space with care? What does it mean for these islands to kind of have had a certain care? They're under the. I mean, it's a whole other conversation, but you know, this idea of reserve or preserve, who has access, who gets to control that, what are the limitations? Like, there's a lot of politics involved with that too. But to go into a place where there are been, you know, lots of people who care for it enough to have this ability for these abalone to thrive, right? And so I like to point to that. I also think when I go out to this place, I'm like, it's amazing. I have no cell phone, no Wi-Fi. I get a little like Garmin GPS in case there's like an emergency that I can kind of text somebody. But you're so off the grid. It is so freeing to me. Like it's like a happy place. But I've also talked to people that are like, you know, not everybody feels that way, you know? So like what does it mean to take the ability to experience a place and maybe bring it back? You know, like maybe not every, you know, I do think about access and privilege, and usually I'm on the other side of this where I'm kind of begging for access to places and at the behest of something. I mean, there's still like, you know, processes and bureaucracy, but what does it mean to be able to show this? Like it feels like a privilege to be able to bring it and to be able to share it. And so I hope that that's about possibility. Like I said, like how do we model? How do we learn? How do we care in ways that actually maybe could help our own walking through this place that's often thought of in really not positive ways around the natural spaces. Even though there are natural spaces in Los Angeles. Sometimes people just have this idea of Los Angeles as being so paved over. So like, what is that potential? Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah. Yeah.
About the more about on the abalone shell.
Mhm.
Like you mentioned, or kind of related like the seeing the shells to humans. Kind of. So could you speak a little more about like that connection with abalone shells um and about how you only see them in some places and other places, and just I just like the metaphors. I don't know.
Yeah, so they would have been everywhere. This is like an animal that lived all up and down. In some places, it still is. I mean, I don't see them in our side of Los Angeles, or this side of Los Angeles, but they are important to all coastal Native people. I'm gonna say. I don't usually use words like all, but I think they're just an important animal. For all those reasons I mentioned earlier. The food, the functionality, the regalia, the ceremony. I mean, they're beautiful, if you've interacted with one. Um, I really like how the interior is the beautiful part because so often in like biological science, it's like, oh, like you externally like show off to like attract a mate. And it's like, it's not that, I just think it's like really beautiful that most of their lives, well, their entire lives, it's completely concealed. And it's like this after body that lives on and can be used in ways that are really incredible. I think I lost the train of your question exactly. Like why are they so important? So they're just important to like many people. They would have been all over the coastal areas in abundance. I think it points. So one thing I think is really beautiful is through that at Getty show, I met with some abalone scientists who work out of San Pedro who are actually actively working to repopulate, and some of their places they're getting from are these spaces. So this idea of bringing it back is actually not at all a fantasy. I think that it also points to, well, speaking of shell mounds and Deloney getting their shell mound back, um, shell mounds point to a sophisticated understanding of how to uh, it's not just like I'm gathering, it was like a sophisticated farming system that didn't deplete, right? So we have this idea that, oh, then the Europeans came in and they started farming the shells and then they all went away. It's like, no, it was always farmed. The magnitude of these shell mounds that exist in Northern California and in Florida point to the fact that it couldn't have naturally occurred in those numbers. And so it's again shifting this idea that there are sustainable ways to interact with nature that aren't devastating. And part of that is not seeing, I try very intentionally not to say the word resource because it's about extraction to me. It's hard. Like sometimes it's, but it's like trying to shift even in the language, how we think of our interactions. I mean, even tar pointing to oil, and sometimes it does point to these oil spills and the devastation of that. But like there was an ancient, always ancestral interaction with this material that wasn't unhealthy to the land. So that was maybe not answering the question, but yeah. All right. Thank you.